So thank you again for everyone for coming in. It means a lot that you guys are here to listen to my tenure lecture. As Reese mentioned, the title of my lecture is Wide Open Spaces, the Modern City in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and the London Scene. Virginia Woolf's engagement with London, a city she loved and lived in, is reflected in her own writings. Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925, is an example which features London as it chronicles one day in June in 1923 in the life of Clarissa Dalloway, a charming woman over 50, alongside other individuals who roamed the city. As we look into Woolf's treatment of urban space, we could also cite instances in the London Scene essays to show how she addressed spaces of religion, government, and commerce. On these next two slides, you'll see some samples from the first two essays from the London Scene as captured from the British Library's collection. So the London Scene essays were originally published as 6 separate articles in the British edition of Good Housekeeping magazine and were meant for an audience of middle-class women who were primarily North American and European bourgeois. These works were published, as you see here on slide 2, as The Docks of London. So this was in December 1931. And then followed by Oxford Street Tide, and thereafter Great Men's Houses, Abbeys and Cathedrals. This is the House of Commons, and lastly, Portrait of a Londoner. So all of these essays dating from December 1931 to December 1932. The novel Mrs. Dalloway reveals Woolf's approach to modern life, which deviates from the belief that women in public, particularly women apparently wandering without aim, are non-respectable, and thus the work also compels us, its readers, to re-examine the prioritization of the street and public arena in the very definition of modernity. For this discussion, I will analyze select characters from Mrs. Dalloway as I consider female experiences in the modern city. And then The Docks of London and Oxford Street Tide from the London Scene will provide context on women's interactions with commodity culture. While others have tagged Charles Baudelaire's flaneur as a paradigm of modernity, I argue that Virginia Woolf's women do not aspire for flaneurie, but instead explore their many visible presences in urban life. At times, I liken them to apparitions, as they are called on to rebuild the city so that it can accommodate the expanding possibilities for women in the early 20th century. This leaves us then with a view of modernism and modernity, which recognizes women's increasing visibility in society, of women not just being one thing or in one place, but instead having access to a range of prospects suited for the different spaces they occupy in this modern environment. In their introduction to Locating Woolf, The Politics of Space and Place in 2007, Anna Snaith and Michael Whitworth observe that the increasing centrality of Baudelaire and the idea of the flaneur to theorizations of modernism posed a challenge to feminist thinkers and therefore to critics of Woolf. Here on the slide, I show a brief outline as taken from Johanna Wagner of those who are often cited in the great flaneur debate, among them Janet Wolff's The Invisible Flaneuse, Women and the Literature of Modernity, which was published in 1985. In this essay, Janet Wolff stresses that what is missing in the literature of modernity is any account of life outside the public realm, of the experience of the modern in its private manifestations, and also of the very different nature of the experience of those women who did appear in the public arena. Tema Balducci notes how Baudelaire's portrayal of the flaneur has been particularly influential in feminist scholarship since the 1980s. Thus, well-to-do women, at least in scholarship, were all but confined to the domestic arena, while well-to-do men, a la Baudelaire's flaneur, thrived and felt most at home in public spaces. These discussions have led some researchers to focus on the marginalization and absence of women, especially in light of the modern being defined around activities in the public sphere, hence gendered male. Scholars then concluded that if the flaneur is equivalent to modern man, and then the flaneuse could be a worthy counterpart, especially if women were to be seen participating in the emerging modern activities of shopping and cinema going. Writing in the year 2000, the same year that Deborah Parsons released her counter-argument to Janet Woolf, Christine Moran and Alma Young examine how urban studies has since started to consider gender in discussions of the city from its avoidance of women's lived experiences in earlier decades. First, they say, women and men's experiences in the city are different, and that these differences center largely on relations of inequality. Second, that women's use of active space and time often results in changes to the spatial and social structure of the city. And third, that structural changes can alter gender relations within the city. Later in 2003, Janet Woolf would propose somewhat of an end to the debate with her essay Gender and the Haunting of Cities, or The Retirement of the Flaneur, where she asserts that the flaneuse is no longer invisible, disputing her own claims in 1985, but now she's saying that it's altogether impossible and hence should be retired. In its place, she urges a move towards looking at the city as itself a discursive construct, and the public and private as a narrative device. In doing so, she says, the question of female flaneurie loses all importance, and at the same time, women become entirely visible in their own particular practices and experiences in the modern city. While Virginia Woolf writes about women who walk on their own as well as with others, their participation in London life relies heavily on their evolving role in society. As Stephanie Lovelace notes when she comments on Michel de Sarto's Walking in the City, this is from The Practice of Everyday Life, published in 1980, she says that de Sarto proposes his own methods of walking as a tactic of creative resistance to the systems of repression that, for him, are structurally built into our urban environments. Of course, no matter how revolutionary the aim, whether embodied in the 19th century flaneur, the psychogeographer of the 1950s, or the tactical walker of the 1980s, this ability to roam the streets remains constricted by gender, race, class, and ability. Hence, rather than resorting to the flaneur or flaneuse to explain their movements in the city, I propose a reading that sees women as apparitions as they navigate the streets in urban space. I endeavor to read women in the modern city not as marginalized or absent figures, but instead as present, active beings who are necessary to our understanding of Woolf's modernism. I now proceed to the next section of my discussion, which is modernism and the city. Modernist studies credit the work of the French poet Charles Baudelaire, specifically The Painter of Modern Life, written in 1859 to 60, first published in 1863, for discussions around the artist and, in turn, modern man in relation to the city. In this essay, Baudelaire models his modern hero on the artist named Constantine Guy, from whom he imagines the flaneur, who gives himself over to the crowd, and the dandy, who holds himself aloof and unmoved. Baudelaire's flaneur has thus made modern man an individual who is seen as the lover of universal life, who enters into the crowd as though it were an immense reservoir of electrical energy. Baudelaire's take on the modern, which he defined as the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent, the half of art whose other half is the eternal and the immutable, would be most apparent in the transitory encounters of modern life and the rapidly changing environment that contributed to the shaping of the individual, which would then be expressed in the literature of the age. Another prominent figure in discussions around urban space is the German literary critic Walter Benjamin. The Arcades Project, Benjamin's unfinished research on 19th century Paris, provides a theoretical stimulus for cultural theory and philosophical concepts of the modern. Benjamin builds on Baudelaire's concept of the flaneur in relation to the city, saying that the street becomes a dwelling for the flaneur. He is as much at home among the facades of houses as a citizen is in his four walls. In addition to the flaneur, Baudelaire and Benjamin also offer the dandy, the rag picker, and the prostitute as emblematic modern urban types. All of these have their origins in the radically new conjunction of the rise of a commodity culture and the expansion of major metropolitan centers. Woolf's prominence in English modernism has meant that her works continue to be analyzed in relation to Baudelaire and Benjamin. But even though we may draw those connections, Woolf is not so easily categorized if seen solely on the basis of her association with the modernists of her time. Bryony Randall recognizes how Woolf exhibits what she calls her strength in the margins, one who is both a founding figure of modernism, but always already a provoking problem for it. Randall continues by saying that Woolf's emergence from the margins of modernist studies makes her particularly apt to keep challenging the very definition she continually contributes to constructing. Meanwhile, Melba Kadikin looks to Woolf's Modernist Manifesto, the 1919 essay entitled Modern Fiction, and says that the author fits within the general paradigm of modernism's shift from the rational and representational to the alogical and associative. However, her treatment of such binary opposition is neither so simple nor so neat. Woolf's modernism thus rests on an inclination towards possibilities for further change and development, which reflects onto her treatment of female characters and the city they live in as not fixed and therefore defined by their manifold presences in the urban environment. We get a glimpse of Woolf's portrayal of women in the context of modernity, partially through the memories of Clarissa's friend, Peter Walsh, who looks back on their younger country life in Burton when he describes Clarissa. If in Clarissa's present thoughts, she is, at least at one point, Mrs. Richard Dalloway, Peter's statements belong to the past, referring to the Clarissa he once proposed marriage to but was rejected in their youth. His initial memories of Clarissa also connect us to the final lines of the novel, which remain visibly in the past. And those two instances you'll see on the slide here. She stood, as he had often seen her, in a doorway with lots of people around her. But it was Clarissa one remembered. Not that she was striking, not beautiful at all. There was nothing picturesque about her. She never said anything specially clever. There she was, however, there she was. Then in the final scenes of the novel, Peter thinks, "What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement? It is Clarissa," he said, "for there she was." The image of a modern woman based on Clarissa is someone whose links to the past contribute to her own present identity. We can attribute this to modernity itself, which, according to Spiropoulos, is the epoch most conscious of history precisely because it is so conscious of itself as present, soon to become past. This experience of the now as something unique and forever passing inevitably creates conditions favorable to anxiety and nostalgia and generates the need for constant self-definition vis-a-vis the past. Another contributing factor to Clarissa's Clarissa's identity is women's expanding mobility starting in the late 19th century, which saw the emergence of spaces designed for consumers, from department stores to tea shops. Many of these were aimed at an audience less economically privileged than Woolf, female clerks and women shopping for mass-marketed goods in Oxford Street department stores. So Oxford Circus is what's on your screen at this point, or buying inexpensive meals in modest but genteel restaurants. In examining Woolf's treatment of social class in the novel, we can take notice of how Clarissa's journey begins at her home in Westminster, one of London's most exclusive residential areas, then on to a royal park, St. James's, and to its premier shopping street, which is Bond Street, where she goes to buy flowers. Against the divine vitality of London's street life, these locations represent what Bradshaw calls Carissa's gilded confinement. He observes that once she is in Bond Street, she is not even Clarissa anymore, but more formally and restrictively, Mrs. Richard Dalloway. While Clarissa is a woman who can walk the city alone to do her shopping without being looked at as an anomaly, she is still, inevitably, Mrs. Richard Dalloway as she proceeds to buy flowers for that evening's party. This then puts women at a precarious position if we are to see them as apparitions, while also performing the task of remaking the city as Woolf envisions them in these sampled works. According to Hoberman, Marx's notion of commodity fetishism suggested that commodities reify the labor that produced them while hypnotizing consumers. And women in particular seemed vulnerable. Rachel Bowlby chronicles the process by which shopping became a new feminine leisure activity, one that positioned women as yielding objects to the powerful male subject, forming and informing them of their desires. Rather than fitting human needs, in other words, commodities threaten to overwhelm human agency. One example from the novel of women's close contact with commodities is seen when Elizabeth and her tutor, the degradingly poor Doris Gilman, go to the Army and Navy stores at Victoria Street in Westminster. This is a department store, and curiously, this is what we now know as supposedly the soon-to-be shut 150-year-old House of Fraser, still on Victoria Street. What department did Miss Gilman want? Elizabeth interrupted her. Petticoats, she said abruptly, and stalked straight on to the lift. Up they went. Elizabeth guided her this way and that, guided her in her abstraction, as if she had been a great child, an unwieldy battleship. There were the petticoats, brown, decorous, striped, frivolous, solid, flimsy, and she chose, in her abstraction, portentously, and the girl serving thought her mad. Elizabeth rather wondered, as they did up the parcel, what Miss Gilman was thinking. And then on her way out, since Elizabeth at this point had gone on, Miss Gilman almost forgets her petticoat, then musters all her strength to keep still amid the further onslaught of commodity. And so that passage goes. Through all the commodities of the world, perishable and permanent, hams, drugs, flowers, stationery, variously smelling, now sweet, now sour, she lurched. Saw herself thus lurching with her hat askew, very red in the face, full length in a looking glass, and at last came out into the street. With "and at last," it sounds as if the street serves as Miss Gilman's escape from the suffocating hold of merchandise. Even for the supposedly strong of conviction, such as Miss Gilman, who is clearly of a different class as Clarissa's, the imposition of the shops cannot be so easily dismissed. Her struggle in this resistance is clear, as she is never completely disengaged from her immediate environment, despite her best efforts. Miss Gilman's scenes leave me asking some questions that Huberman also questioned, or particularly this train of thought that she follows with the following question. Does Woolf see shopping as offering women an empowering flaneuse-like agency? Or is she evoking a modernist marketplace, one shaping both her own consciousness and that of her characters in ways she seems to accept, if not celebrate? Noticeably, of course, in the first question from Huberman, she relies on the flaneuse for her examination of Woolf's work, one which I would replace with the apparition as possible agent in the commodity environment, which then leads to the inevitable question: can the apparition even be empowered in this scenario? The process of commodification is further illustrated in the docks of London and Oxford Street Tide from the London scene. When Woolf describes the docks in the Docks of London, which is a portion of which you see here, she provides details of the city's might over the Tower of London and Tower Bridge. And there she writes, as we come closer to the Tower Bridge, the authority of the city begins to assert itself. Here growls and grumbles that rough city song that has called the ships from the sea and brought them to lie captive beneath its warehouses. In the midst of the river, the force of commerce is met by the dominance of the city. It is as if these ships holding timber, iron, grain, and the like can only cower on its spot in deference to urban rule. And so, meanwhile, in Oxford Street Tide, Woolf emphasizes transitory elements which are somehow expected to fit together, and yet they don't. The mind becomes a glutinous slab that takes impressions, and Oxford Street rolls off upon it a perpetual ribbon of changing sights, sound, and movement. Buses, vans, cars, barrows stream past like the fragments of a picture puzzle. The puzzle never fits itself together, however long we look. There is a resignation in these lines that give in to the disordered world, a kind of acceptance and knowing that no human and prolonged effort of looking can fully grasp modern life's persistent force. When studied in light of Commodities, it then becomes possible for us to see women as having to grapple with the city's incoherence, all the more so as they try to understand their identities in this new and constantly changing environment. As Huberman writes, despite Woolf's traditional reputation as an ascetic priestess of art and inwardness, she repeatedly insists on the important role commodities play in her own and her characters' lives. I now proceed to the next portion of my discussion, which is Woolf's women as apparitions. Woolf displaces the view of women as recipients of the flaneur's gaze, admiration, or pity, that is, the prostitute, the widow, the old lady, the lesbian, the murder victim, and the passing unknown woman. Instead, the female is someone who demonstrates visible interactions with the city, which regards her as a perceptible apparition who reflects the fleeting character of the urban environment. We see Clarissa expressing that she loved walking in London, which at first could be taken as a resemblance to Baudelaire's flaneur, a passionate spectator who finds an immense joy to set up house in the heart of the multitude and amid the ebb and flow of movement in the midst of the fugitive and the infinite. What is problematic with seeing Clarissa as flaneur is that in Baudelaire and Benjamin's definitions, she can never completely belong to the city streets because she is a woman. What we can recognize instead is how, by leaving her home in Westminster to buy flowers at Bond Street, which is indicated in the very first line of the novel, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. Clarissa's movement indicates an active yet temporary engagement with the city. She pursues this activity and explores a portion of the city because it aligns with her role as the perfect hostess, one that requires her to go back home in order to host her party. As Forbes notes, Clarissa loves London because the city environment provides a sense of order, vitality, and stability she lacks within herself. In addition, London validates and celebrates Clarissa's choice of performing the role of the perfect hostess. Clarissa's daughter Elizabeth shows promise in the faint possibilities that are available for women in the city. One notable scene is Elizabeth's journey, which begins at Victoria Street, initially with her tutor Doris Gilman at the earlier described Army and Navy stores, as you see here in the advertisement on the slide, along with an image of the Strand. This trip becomes an opportunity for reflection as Elizabeth goes on a spontaneous omnibus ride alone through the city. And so the piece goes, buses swooped, settled, were off. But which one would she get onto? She had no preferences. She inclined to be passive. Elizabeth eventually finds herself on the Strand, passing Somerset House and thinking that she liked the feeling of people working. It was quite different here from Westminster, she thought, getting off Chancery Lane. It was so serious. It was so busy. In short, she would like to have a profession. And even though her thoughts made her quite determined, whatever her mother might say, to become either a farmer or a doctor, she acknowledges that she is, quote, rather lazy. Elizabeth is unable to navigate this unknown territory because she has no female model from whom she can determine her next move. When she makes an effort to avoid dark alleys, it is made clear that no Dalloways came down the Strand daily. She was a pioneer, a stray, venturing, trusting. Elizabeth only had her own instincts as company on this pioneering journey, which puts her in a position of relying on the city itself as guide for where she goes next. But then she quickly realizes it was later than she thought. Her mother would not like her to be wandering off alone like this. She turned back down the Strand and then mounted the Westminster omnibus. It is as if she's woken from a trance and the city calls her back to reality. Elizabeth's short trip does not allow her to reach a conclusion as to a definite career choice, but instead makes her realize that she must go home, she must dress for dinner, back to a life that echoes that of her mother's. Instead of what she momentarily considers, which is a profession, this is what she was supposed to follow. There was in the Dalloway family the tradition of public service, abbesses, principals, headmistresses, dignitaries in the Republic of Women. If at first Elizabeth may have encouraged thoughts of becoming a farmer or a doctor, it becomes clear that none of those earlier options fit into those previously performed by the Republic of Women in her own family. If she does eventually decide to pursue a career, then would most likely be in the vein of public service, as other women in the family had done before her. Even Elizabeth's consciousness of and reference to time when she says, "But what was the time? Where was the clock?" is reminiscent of the structure and sense of order that Clarissa herself requires as she goes about her day leading up to that much-awaited dinner party. While it is possible for Elizabeth to explore the city on her own and even start to think about other professions, urban life for women seems to always draw them back to the home or alternatively have them fulfill the roles that other women before them have pursued. Only Elizabeth seems to get closest to forging a new path, but she finds herself rudderless, as if lost in an entirely new city that has provided a clear roadmap for men and left no fixed directions as of yet for women. And while it may seem that Elizabeth and Clarissa are free to go about their day, they are not career women, nor do they escape society's expectations. For one, as earlier mentioned, Clarissa is portrayed as the perfect hostess, which Peter accurately predicts her to become upon marrying Richard Dalloway, when he says that she had the makings of a perfect hostess. And so Clarissa ends the novel as that. Elizabeth's thoughts of a career lead her back home to Westminster, and by the end is seen by her father and other party guests as a thing of beauty. These two might seem to embody the flaneur in some aspects or engage with activities associated with flaneurie like shopping or wandering aimlessly, but only temporarily. What is made more evident is how Woolf explores the role of women in the city as apparitions because she clearly recognizes the need to contend with the inescapable limitations that exist around women in urban space. But given our earlier acknowledgement of the limitation of the apparition as a sole figure to take the place of the flaneur or flaneuse, the female in the modern city unavoidably represents an experience of paradox, one that Woolf herself would confront in her own life as a woman writer of the age. Elizabeth's omnibus scene is a reminder of the persistent omission of women which exists amid the changing landscape in Woolf's time. Bradshaw writes that Although Woolf's London holds the promise of extramural freedom and increasing employment opportunities, especially for women, it also abounds with reminders of the omission of women, the dispossessed, and everyone but the governing elite from the infrastructures of patriarchal power. But instead of simply acknowledging this as a representation of women's absence in urban life, Woolf finds the supposedly absent women a place within her writings, if only to explore the still largely uncharted possibilities for women in the city. A poetic example of this is when Woolf introduces a battered woman in the novel whose singing is first heard by Peter Walsh. A sound interrupted him, a frail, quivering sound, a voice bubbling up without direction, vigor, beginning or end, running weakly and shrilly, and with an absence of all human meaning. The voice of no age or sex, the voice of an ancient spring sprouting from the earth. The passage continues to describe the battered woman, for she wore a skirt, with her right hand exposed, her left clutching at her side, stood singing of love, love which has lasted 1,000,000 years. The scene harks to a female tradition that has been at times unheard, if not misunderstood, but it also emphasizes how such a presence can simultaneously evoke the impression of an absence of all human meaning from one perspective, presumably Peter's, then from another, the eventual realization that the woman was there singing of love. The city is very much incorporated into this moment, as if the woman's presence by way of song travels, finding its roots in the midst of the modern environment. As the ancient song bubbled up opposite Regent's Park tube station, still the earth seemed green and flowery, and skeletons and treasure streamed away in rivulets over the pavement and all along the Marylebone Road and down towards Euston, fertilizing, leaving a damp stain. Woolf gives a voice to women in these examples, whether they are fully understood or not by the people around them. But she also leaves room for presenting the forces that persist and are constantly provoked by the rapidly changing city. Oxford Street is such a place where these voices exist, as Woolf writes in Oxford Street Tide. In order to hear them, she instructs who she calls the moralist to tune his strain so that it receives into it some queer, incongruous voices. Above the racket of van and omnibus, we can hear them crying. Just as Clarissa, who has to compete with the city's own voices when she urges Peter to remember my party tonight, having to raise her voice against the roar of the open air and overwhelmed by the traffic and the sound of all the clocks striking. Her efforts seem blighted when it's mentioned how she sounded frail and thin and very far away as Peter Walsh shut the door. It may be likely that Woolf intends for Clarissa's voice to be drowned out in the city's noise as an affront to her superfluous gathering. Nonetheless, it is one indication of the threat to women who are predisposed to disappear from city life altogether, and yet their presence still visibly haunts and patiently lurks in the shadows, reappearing and lingering throughout this environment. In Oxford Street Tide, the people who own such voices include a man who sells tortoises, a great merchant, a middle class woman, and a thief, of what Woolf calls a woman of that persuasion. She writes, "1,000 such voices are always crying aloud in Oxford Street. All are tense, all are real, all are urged out of their speakers by the pressure of making a living, finding a bed, somehow keeping afloat on the bounding, careless, remorseless tide of the street. Even a moralist must allow that this gaudy, bustling, vulgar street reminds us that life is a struggle." Woolf highlights these working men and women who make possible the continued movement of the city. Alongside the men of Oxford Street are the women who also cry aloud for their voices to be heard amid the struggle of life in the modern city. I now proceed to the final portion of my discussion, which is rebuilding the city. Oxford Street Tide includes a compelling address to the women who would have likely read this piece in Good Housekeeping. We do not build for our descendants, who may live up in the clouds or down in the earth, but for ourselves and our own needs. We knock down and rebuild as we expect to be knocked down and rebuilt. It is an impulse that makes for creation and fertility. While Woolf here writes about a particular section of London that is tied to commodities, she might as well be urging her female characters to build the city on their own terms. That is, despite the challenge of having to rebuild again later on. There is a similar instance in the Docks of London, where Woolf seeks to, as Wood says, empower her female. The only thing one comes to feel that can change the routine of the docks is a change in ourselves. It is we, our tastes, our fashions, our needs that make the cranes dip and swing, that call the ships from the sea. Our body is their master. Trade watches us anxiously to see what new desires are beginning to grow in us, what new dislikes. Woolf speaks directly to generations of women, maybe other Clarissas who seem resigned to old age, even death, in conventions. But it is perhaps someone like Elizabeth who is Woolf's ideal audience, one who explores the city on her own to consider other careers. That is, if only it were possible in reality for Elizabeth to escape her class bound and gendered destiny and thereafter build a life that is different from the ones lived by her mother and all women before her. But we know that it would take many more Elizabeths to form the community of women who will later find themselves wandering and exploring a city that they can emphatically call home. When seen in the context of the novel, Woolf's vision of rebuilding the city is hinged on the title character's positioning as a rather ambivalent figure. For example, Clarissa would not say of Peter, she would not say of herself, I am this, I am that. While Peter remembers Clarissa saying once as they were sitting on the bus going up Shaftesbury Avenue, she felt herself everywhere, not here, 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 and she tapped the back of her seat, but everywhere. She waved her hand going up Shaftesbury Avenue. She was all that. So that to know her, or anyone, one must seek out the people who completed them, even the places. A comparable line appears in Woolf's 1927 essay, Street Hunting, a London Adventure, where she writes, am I here or am I there? Or is the true self neither this nor that, neither here nor there, but something so varied and wandering that it is only when we give the rein to its wishes and let it take its way unimpeded that we are indeed ourselves. The city's rebuilding in Woolf's own time and in her writings rests on the lives of such individuals, women who are not yet clearly defined, hardly given a name or voice, and yet at the same time find themselves existing everywhere, like far-reaching and infinite apparitions, in the same manner that Woolf hunts in her most treasured walks around London. As Janet Wolff points out, this is in her essay in 2003, there is a recurring use of the language of ghosts and hunting in recent literature about the city and urban space, citing studies of scholars in urban and architectural theory. She references the sociologist Avery Gordon, who insisted that hunting is essential to the sociological imagination. And there Gordon writes, the ghost is not simply a dead or a missing person, but a social figure, and investigating it can lead to that dense site where history and subjectivity make social life. The ghost or the apparition is one form by which something is lost or barely visible, or something seemingly not there to our supposedly well-trained eye, makes itself known or apparent to us, in its own way, of course. While Virginia Woolf recognized a shrouded power in this practice of hunting by women in the city, I must reiterate that using the figure of the apparition, thus relying on a singular being or persona to challenge Baudelaire's flaneur and even the scholar's favorite flaneuse, poses its own limitations for viewing women's condition in the modern city. Instead of choosing a side in the great flaneur debate, perhaps it would be more productive to admit that ultimately there is more than one way to read Woolf's women. And in turn, this would allow us to appreciate and analyze English modernism and modernity for its many contradictions as we continue to challenge its definitions in the same manner that Virginia Woolf herself did in her own time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and our discussions on the topic.
Thank you very much, Professor Agaloos. So now we will invite Dr. Mikey Atienza to share her reaction to the tenure lecture that we just heard. So let me just pin Dr. Atienza. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Uh, Thanks, Reese. Can everyone hear me? That's
Yes.
okay. And thanks, Loren, also for such a rich lecture. There are so many ideas that I think are worth exploring, but I also think that this reading of scenes from Mrs. Dalloway and Virginia Woolf's writing in Good Housekeeping covers some familiar ground, and that's where I wanted to start. So this lecture briefly takes us back to Baudelaire and Benjamin, and it highlights how their writing creates these urban figures or presents certain urban figures or types, and how they describe ways of seeing and moving, and also ways of writing or making art within the 20th century city. But more importantly, I think the lecture acknowledges the central role that this body of work has played in so much subsequent discussion of urban space in modernist literature. So Loren points out that the strain of modernist criticism that developed out of Baudelaire and Benjamin's work created these definitions of modernity that prioritize the street and the public arena. And this paper focuses on the development of new commercial spaces and the movements and behaviors of the figures that populated them. The flaneur was a key figure in such discussions, but as we've seen, neither this term nor its counterpart or proposed counterpart, the flaneuse, did very much to forward or give critics adequate tools to discuss women's urban experience, let alone any remaking or rebuilding of urban space. So this lecture, as much as it is about the writing of Virginia Woolf, is also about a modernist criticism that that presents women or is kind of limited in its discussion of women's urban experience, at least in that period between the 1980s and the 2000s, early 2000s, that Loren talks about in the first half. It's a limited discussion of women's experience and of gender and space more broadly. And so I think the lecture is also interested in the extent to which this criticism is or has been able to meet the writing of Virginia Woolf. And I think it's trying to answer that or give us some possible solutions. The lecture acknowledges the importance of those earlier discussions, but by anchoring itself on the later work of people like Janet Wolfe, it updates and starts to take us beyond frameworks based on Baudelaire and Benjamin's work. And it does so, I think, to productive ends that I think will benefit those of us who are teaching periods of literary history, those of us who are teaching the so-called canon, or more importantly, those of us who are interested in reevaluating how we teach the canon. So in my case, in 2016, I was still introducing modernist writing using those old frameworks. And the updated bibliography that Loren presents in this lecture, I think at least will help me update my own 131 syllabus. In her lecture, Loren talks about the limits of existing theories and ways of writing about the 20th century city, and she proposes and tests some possible alternatives. So in response to a modernist criticism that has written about women in terms of absence or as objects of the flaneur's gaze or as one of several possible urban types, she offers us the apparition. And I think this is also in response to Janet Wolfe's interrogation of those ideas. So how can we understand or test this as a tool for writing about Wolfe's women and how they navigate or rebuild or at least interact with the city? And in the lecture, I think we get several suggestions for how to do this. We can think about this idea in relation to time. And of the apparition as this amalgam of past and present selves that are not always distinct. We can think about it in relation to mobility as well, and of how women of a certain class have greater freedom of movement and greater access to public space, And in the case of Clarissa, Dalloway, who expressly goes out to buy flowers, also some purchasing power. But despite these things, remain restricted in other ways. And yet, as Loren points out, in some sections of the novel feel themselves to be not here, here, but everywhere. I think we can also be more pointed looking at how women move through commercial areas like Bond Street and Oxford Street, and can explore what seems like an odd scenario, which is the apparition that shops. And I think this is a fruitful line of questioning, and to me, one of the most interesting aspects of this paper, how women move, that diffuseness, and the fact that by virtue of Virginia Woolf's prose, women and the city are not always distinct or separate. How does this work in a place like Shaftesbury Avenue or the Strand? And I think this is an especially interesting focus in a novel like Woolf's or like Mrs. Dalloway, because it is so interested in pleasure and in comfort and in the value of material objects, even as it often questions this interest as frivolous, or as Ms. Gilman might put it, even a little immoral. And there's that moralist in the London Scene essays that I'm curious about as well. And as Loren points out, there are some contradictions here. How can an apparition remake the material world or even participate in material culture? But I think that the lecture is also starting to work through this problem. And I think it does so partly by focusing on looking and on visibility. Loren suggests that in Woolf's work, these characters are not merely recipients of the flaneur's gaze, admiration, or pity, but people who engage with the city and who have the interesting phrase, visible interactions with it. And while Clarissa, Elizabeth, and Miss Kilman are not always objects of someone else's gaze, throughout the novel, Woolf tells us, and she tells us quite often, how these characters are seen by themselves and by others. So I think maybe we can think about this seeing, looking, watching, and in doing so, we focus not only on the spectral or ghostly or transitory aspects of the apparition, but on their status as entities, as something that is simply seen. And in ways that might be different from, say, the flaneur seeing his image in a shop window. I also think that Woolf has a different formulation for this that might cut across her work. So maybe Loren has some comments on this. Into the Lighthouse, she describes our apparitions as the things you know us by. And I wonder if there's a link to be explored here between the apparition as something that others can know women by, and the role that shopping might play in this process of making ourselves known or seen. So maybe this is a question for Loren later on. Is there something in To the Lighthouse or in some of Woolf's other work that might help us build on this idea of the apparition? In other words, does Woolf give us the tools to build out this tool or concept of the apparition? The lecture is concerned with a related question. Towards the end of her second section, Loren asks, can the apparition be empowered in such scenarios? And as she points out, Miss Kilman succumbing to the onslaught of hams and stationery does seem to support the arguments from Rachel Bowlby or Hoberman, that commodities would threaten to overwhelm human agency, and that shopping somehow positions women as yielding objects to a male subject that forms and informs them of their desires or dictates their tastes. But the passage that Loren then takes from the Docks of London, I think, is a striking rebuttal to this. It is we, her quote reads, our tastes, our fashions, our needs that make the cranes dip and swing, that call the ships from the sea, our body is their master. I think there's always the possibility that the narrator here maybe is unaware that her tastes are being dictated by other by other forces, but maybe this declaration that we make the cranes dip and swing, and that trade watches us to discover our desires, is an attempt to maybe recast women as not passive consumers, but as active stakeholders, or maybe even driving forces. Or it could be a kind of provocation, or is it maybe an attempt to speak to women or to wake them, communicating through a women's magazine that notably is part of the machinery that shapes those desires in the first place. And here I think that the dialogue between Mrs. Dalloway and Virginia Woolf's writing in Good Housekeeping proves to be really productive. And I think it's worth exploring in further essays, even just in terms of shifting our attention to other aspects of the novel that we might not typically focus on when teaching our period courses. For instance, when we're studying Mrs. Dalloway in class, I think it's important to teach students how to approach the prose and not to panic when they see that the free indirect technique and all of these things. But for students who have expressed an interest in doing feminist and materialist readings of Woolf, why not emphasize that this is a novel about shopping, and that it is obsessed with material comforts and pleasures, but also slightly ashamed of those obsessions. And so I was happy to see that aspect of modernism highlighted. And I also think that it's quite timely because in the last 2 decades, modernist critics have been questioning those very rigid oppositions between highbrow and lowbrow, or Virginia Woolf's middle brow, between art and commodity. And they've been contesting this notion that there is a classicist streak that's somehow at odds with an appreciation of popular forms and a participation in all sorts of aspects of social life, going to restaurants, going shopping, going to music halls, etc. When many modernists were genuinely interested in and immersed in these activities. Modernism, or modernists, have also expressed a growing interest in the periodical networks of the 20th century, but where and how do women's magazines fit into these networks? So the Oxford History of Modernist Magazines does not feature Good Housekeeping and Harper's Bazaar and those things next to Scrutiny or the Criterion or the Dial. But I think that that's changing, and that there is a growing interest in how women's magazines might give us a richer picture of modernism. And I think that the work that that we're seeing in this lecture kind of fits into these developments that are taking place in the field, and that is very exciting. So thank you, Loren, for a really interesting and generative lecture, and I look forward to hearing more about Woolf in Good Housekeeping especially.